My name is Kate, an ordinary office worker in my 30s, but the path that led me here was far from simple. Growing up in my family was never easy, especially with my older sister Susan, who always seemed to outshine me. Ever since we were children, Susan was the golden child, the one our parents doted on endlessly. She was beautiful, talented, and had a gift for playing the piano. My parents adored her, often showering her with praise, attention, and gifts. Meanwhile, I, Kate, the younger, quieter daughter, was left in the shadows. No matter how hard I tried, I could never measure up to Susan. Our parents were so proud of her piano competitions and modeling gigs, and conversations at home always revolved around her successes. It felt like they only had space in their hearts for one daughter, and that daughter wasn't me. Though I tried to make them proud through my academic achievements, their focus remained on Susan. It was a lonely and painful way to grow up, always feeling like I wasn't good enough. As the years passed, the gap between Susan and me widened. In middle school, she became even more stunning, and her modeling career began to flourish. People always admired her for her beauty, and even her teachers praised her talents. Meanwhile, I continued to excel in school, focusing on my studies to escape the emotional neglect at home. But despite my academic achievements, they went unnoticed. My parents barely acknowledged my efforts, and it hurt deeply. They were too wrapped up in Susan's life, celebrating every little success she had. At times, I felt invisible in my own family, like I didn't belong. The few times they did talk to me, it was mostly to compare me to Susan. "Why can't you be more like her?" they would ask. It was as if my value was measured by how closely I could resemble her, and I could never meet those expectations. It seemed like my purpose in the family was to not be a burden, and I accepted that role, quietly fading into the background. In high school, things didn't improve. Susan became even more confident, almost arrogant, and her behavior towards me grew colder. She avoided me at school, pretending we weren't related. "I don't want my friends to know you're my sister," she once told me. Those words stung deeply, but what hurt even more was that our parents seemed to understand her feelings. They would tell me to keep my distance from Susan at school, as if my mere presence was a source of shame. I was isolated, not only from my sister, but from my parents as well. This created a deep sense of loneliness within me. Despite this, I kept focusing on my studies, finding comfort in my academic success. At least in school, I could prove my worth through my grades. By the time I graduated, I was one of the top students in my class, but even then, my achievements were overshadowed by Susan's beauty contests and modeling gigs. She was always the center of attention, and I was left standing on the sidelines, watching from a distance. After high school, Susan's life took a different turn. She got into a private university, while I earned a scholarship to a public one. Despite my efforts, my parents didn't celebrate my achievement. Instead, they were too busy talking about Susan's future and how proud they were of her. It was around this time that my relationship with my parents reached its lowest point. When I mentioned wanting to attend a prestigious university, my father's response shocked me. "We can't afford that. We need the money for Susan." That moment solidified what I had always feared. My parents valued Susan far more than they did me. They told me if I wanted to go to college, I'd have to figure it out myself. So I did. I found a university that offered a scholarship, and I worked part-time jobs to support myself. Though I was proud of my independence, I couldn't shake the feeling of resentment. The unfairness of it all weighed heavily on me, and I started to distance myself from my family even more. While I was struggling to make ends meet, Susan lived a comfortable life, still being supported by our parents. She didn't have to work, didn't have to worry about bills, and enjoyed a life of luxury. The disparity between our lives was glaring. I worked long hours after classes, balancing my job and my studies, while Susan partied her way through college, extending her graduation by a year. My parents didn't seem to mind. They continued to support her financially, never asking her to contribute or be responsible. Meanwhile, I was told to pay rent if I wanted to keep living at home. When I finally managed to save enough money, I moved out, eager to escape the toxic environment that had defined my life for so long. But even after leaving, the resentment lingered. My family, especially Susan, had always treated me as if I were second best, and now, living on my own, I finally had the chance to prove that I was more than that. By the time I reached my late 20s, my mother passed away from a long-term illness. Despite everything, I felt little grief. Years of being treated like an outsider in my own family had numbed me to the pain of loss. Susan, on the other hand, was devastated. My father, too, was overcome with sorrow. I felt guilty for not feeling the same, but I couldn't help it. Memories of my mother's favoritism still lingered, and in my mind, her passing didn't erase the years of neglect I had endured. After her death, my father's health began to decline as well. He could no longer live independently, and someone needed to take care of him. I was the obvious choice, as Susan had just gotten married and was focused on her new life. She made it clear that she had no intention of interrupting her happiness to care for our father. "It's your responsibility," she told me. And just like that, the burden of caring for our father fell entirely on me. For a year, I juggled my job and caring for my father. I hired help during the day, but in the evenings and on weekends, it was all on me. Despite everything I had done for him, my father never expressed any gratitude. Instead, he constantly criticized me. Nothing I did was ever good enough. "Lower the water temperature," he would snap. Or, "Why are you so slow?" It felt like no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't win his approval. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. My job was demanding, and the added responsibility of caring for my father drained me even further. I kept going, though, out of a sense of duty. I had spent so many years trying to gain my family's approval, and some part of me still hoped that taking care of my father would finally earn me the recognition I had always wanted. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Then, out of nowhere, Susan and her husband showed up at the house one day. "We're moving in," she announced, her tone casual as if she was doing me a favor. I was stunned. For years, she had shown no interest in helping with our father, but now she was suddenly eager to take control. "You need to leave," she added, her voice cold. It didn't make any sense. Why would she want me out of the house after all I had done? As it turned out, Susan and her husband were struggling financially. Her husband's business wasn't doing well, and they were looking for a way to cut costs. Moving into our family home, with my father still living there, would ease their financial burden. But for me, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. After everything I had sacrificed, they were kicking me out. Susan even had the audacity to accuse me of trying to steal our mother's inheritance by staying in the house with our father. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. As angry as I was, I saw this as my chance to break free. "Fine," I told them. "I'll leave, but I'm taking everything I bought." Susan didn't seem to care, laughing as she told me to do as I pleased. So I did. I packed up all the furniture and appliances I had purchased over the years, the couch, the refrigerator, the washing machine. It was all mine, bought with the money I had earned from my job. Once I had moved everything out, the house was practically empty. A week later, Susan called me, her voice frantic. "Why is the house empty? Where's all the furniture?" I couldn't help but smile as I replied, "I took everything I bought just like you said I could." She was furious, accusing me of leaving her and her husband in an impossible situation. But I didn't care anymore. For once I was in control, and it felt liberating. Susan tried to argue, insisting that some of the things I took belonged to our parents, or that they had been bought with our mother's inheritance. But I knew the truth. After our mother passed, I had been the one paying for everything: the new furniture, the appliances, even the car. I had worked hard to afford those things, and I wasn't about to let Susan take them from me. "You're working for a big company, right? Can't you help us out?" she asked, her voice desperate. I had mentioned the company I worked for in passing, and she had assumed I was making good money. But after years of being treated like the lesser sister, I wasn't about to bail her out now. "No, Susan. I've done enough for this family," I said firmly. "It's time you figured things out for yourself." And with that, I hung up the phone, leaving her to deal with the mess she had created. After that conversation, I felt an immense sense of relief. For the first time in my life, I had stood up to Susan and my family. I no longer felt the need to please them or prove my worth. I had finally taken control of my own life, and it was empowering. I moved into a small but cozy apartment, far away from the toxic environment that had defined my childhood. I furnished it with the items I had taken from the house, and for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. It was my space, my sanctuary, component placement, and no one could take it from me. My relationship with my family was over, and I was okay with that. I had spent years trying to earn their love and approval, but now I realized that I didn't need it. I was enough on my own. Months passed, and I heard little from Susan. Rumor had it that her marriage was falling apart, and her husband had left her. She was struggling financially, just like before, but this time, she didn't have our parents or me to lean on. I should have felt bad for her, but I didn't. After years of being treated like I was less than, it felt good to finally have the upper hand. My father's health continued to decline, but Susan was forced to take care of him now. She had no choice, and from what I heard, she wasn't handling it well. I had moved on with my life, working at a job I enjoyed, and finally finding peace. Every now and then I would think about my family, but the pain and resentment I once felt had faded. I had learned that I didn't need them to be happy. I had built a life for myself, and for the first time in years,